The transport pod hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact that sent Elena tumbling against the padded walls. Warning lights flashed red as the automatic systems performed damage assessment. The cheerful synthetic voice, announcing that landing protocols had been, mostly, successful. Elena would have laughed at the absurdity if her situation weren't so dire. She fumbled with the emergency release, her hands shaking from adrenaline and growing fear. The hatch hissed open, revealing the alien forest in all its overwhelming detail. The trees towered above her like ancient cathedrals, their bark a deep purple-black that seemed to absorb light. Strange flowers dotted the underbrush, pulsing with the same bioluminescent glow she had observed in the wolf-like creatures from orbit. The air was thick and humid, carrying scents that her human nose struggled to process. Some were pleasant, like a mixture of jasmine and mint, while others made her wrinkle her nose in disgust. But underneath it all was a musky, predatory scent that made every instinct scream danger. Elena forced herself to focus on immediate survival. The emergency kit contained a basic shelter unit, water purification tablets, concentrated food bars that tasted like cardboard, and a plasma cutter for defense. The medical supplies were standard for most humanoid species, though she hoped she wouldn't need to test their effectiveness on human physiology. As she activated the shelter unit, a silver disc that expanded into a small dome-shaped structure, Elena tried to process what had happened. 3 years of dedicated service, groundbreaking research, and genuine friendship with her crewmates had meant nothing when faced with species prejudice. They had abandoned her like discarded equipment, with casual efficiency that spoke of long-held biases she had been too naive to recognize. The shelter's interior was cramped but functional, with a basic life support system and communication array. Elena immediately tried to contact the Nexus Dawn but received only static. Either they were too far away, or more likely they had deliberately disabled her ability to reach them. Night fell quickly on the alien world, and with it came sounds that made Elena's blood run cold. Howls echoed through the forest, but these weren't the simple calls of earth wolves. They were complex, layered with harmonic frequencies that seemed almost musical. Through the shelter's transparent walls, she could see bioluminescent patterns moving between the trees, like living constellations navigating the darkness. Elena forced herself to remain calm and scientific. She activated her recording equipment and began documenting everything she observed. The creature's light patterns weren't random. They followed distinct sequences that varied based on the direction of movement and the number of individuals in each group. It was definitely communication, possibly even more sophisticated than she had initially theorized. A sudden scratching sound against the shelter's exterior made her freeze. Through the transparent aluminum, she could see a massive shape investigating the dome. It was one of the wolf-like creatures, even larger than she had estimated from orbit. Its bioluminescent markings pulsed in slow, rhythmic patterns as it circled the shelter. Elena held her breath, trying to remain perfectly still. The creature's head appeared in her field of vision, and she found herself staring into intelligence unlike anything she had encountered. Its eyes weren't the simple predatory orbs she expected, but complex organs that seemed to contain swirling galaxies of color. They regarded her with what could only be described as curiosity. The creature made a sound. Not a growl or howl, but something closer to a questioning whine. Its bioluminescent markings shifted to a softer blue-green pattern that Elena instinctively associated with non-aggression. Without thinking, she moved closer to the wall, studying the intricate display of lights rippling across the creature's massive form. For several minutes, they regarded each other through the barrier. Elena found herself unconsciously mapping the light patterns, noting their correlation with the creature's breathing and subtle body language. This wasn't simple bioluminescence. It was active communication, as complex as any spoken language. When the creature finally moved away, Elena realized she had been holding her breath. Her hands were shaking, but not entirely from fear. There had been something almost friendly about the encounter. The creature could have easily damaged the shelter if it had wanted to, but instead it had simply investigated and moved on. Over the following days, Elena established a routine that balanced survival needs with scientific observation. The creatures, she had taken to calling them luminous ones in her logs, appeared regularly around her camp. Initially, they maintained their distance, but gradually they began approaching closer. Elena noticed patterns in their behavior that confirmed her suspicions about their intelligence. They hunted in coordinated groups using complex light signals to communicate across vast distances. Their social structure was sophisticated, with clear hierarchies and what appeared to be teaching behaviors between adults and juveniles. Most remarkably, they seemed genuinely curious about her. Rather than viewing her as prey or threat, they appeared to regard her as a puzzle to be solved. Elena began leaving food outside her shelter, not to feed them but as a gesture of non-aggression. The luminous ones would investigate these offerings, sometimes taking them but often simply examining them before moving on. On the 5th day, Elena made a breakthrough. She had been experimenting with the shelter's external lights, trying to replicate the simple patterns she had observed. A young luminous one, smaller than the others with lighter markings, approached during one of these sessions. Elena slowly adjusted the lights to pulse in the same rhythm she had seen the creatures use for what appeared to be greeting behavior. The young one stopped, its own markings beginning to pulse in response. For several minutes they engaged in what could only be described as a conversation, with Elena fumbling through basic light patterns while the creature patiently repeated simpler sequences. When the session ended and the young one rejoined its pack, Elena felt a surge of triumph that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with connection. She was actually communicating with an alien intelligence, something the entire Galactic Research Consortium had deemed impossible. As she prepared for another night in the alien forest, Elena realized something had changed in her perspective. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by fascination and a growing sense of purpose. Her colleagues had abandoned her, considering her human emotional tendencies a weakness. But perhaps those same emotional tendencies, her ability to empathize, to see beyond mere data to form connections, were exactly what was needed to bridge the gap between species. The luminous ones weren't just predators to be studied and catalogued. They were intelligent beings with their own culture, language, and curiosity about the universe around them. Elena smiled as she settled in for sleep, the soft glow of bioluminescent patterns visible through her shelter walls. Tomorrow she would try more complex communication sequences. She was no longer just a stranded human fighting for survival. She was a pioneer on the verge of the greatest xenological discovery in galactic history. The metallic corridors of the research vessel Nexus Dawn hummed with alien activity as Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the observation deck's reinforced glass. Below them, the planet designated as Kepler 442c stretched endlessly, its surface a patchwork of dense forests and sprawling grasslands. What made her heart race wasn't the beauty of the untouched world, but the pack of creatures moving through the tree line like liquid shadows. Elena had spent 3 years aboard the Galactic Research Consortium's flagship, the only human among a crew of 12 different alien species. The Zephyrians with their crystalline skin, the hulking Karathi with their 6 arms, and the ethereal Valens who seemed to float rather than walk. She had earned her place through sheer determination and brilliance in xenobiology, but she always felt the weight of being different. "The predators are unlike anything we've catalogued," she murmured into her recording device, watching the wolf-like creatures below. They were massive, easily twice the size of earth wolves, with bioluminescent markings that pulsed along their spines. Their coordination was remarkable, moving as a single organism across the terrain. Commander Zexhai, a towering Karathi with obsidian black carapace, approached with heavy footsteps. His 4 eyes focused on Elena with what she had learned to recognize as disapproval. "Human researcher, your presence is required in the briefing chamber." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. The commander's tone carried an edge she hadn't heard before. She followed him through the winding corridors, passing other crew members who avoided her gaze. The ship's atmosphere felt different, charged with intention she couldn't identify. The briefing chamber was filled with the senior staff, their various forms creating an intimidating circle around the central holographic display. Dr. Thys, the lead Zephyrian scientist, stood at the center, her crystalline form refracting the blue light into rainbow patterns across the walls. "We have received new directives from the Consortium Council," Dr. Thys announced, her voice carrying the harmonic quality typical of her species. "The planet below has been reclassified as a high-risk environment. The predator species shows signs of advanced pack intelligence and territorial aggression that exceeds acceptable parameters for standard research protocols. Elena stepped forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her growing unease. But that's exactly why we need to study them. Their coordination suggests a level of intelligence that could revolutionize our understanding of pack dynamics. I've been developing communication protocols that might allow us to— The human's suggestions are noted but irrelevant, Commander Zexai interrupted, his mandibles clicking in what Elena knew was agitation. The Council has determined that continued research poses unacceptable risks to crew safety. We are to abandon this mission and proceed to the Andromeda sector for mineral surveys. Abandon? Elena felt her world tilting. But we've barely scratched the surface. The behavioral patterns I've observed suggest these creatures might be trying to communicate. Their bioluminescent displays aren't random. They're structured, almost like a language. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Elena looked around at faces that had become familiar over 3 years, searching for any sign of support. Instead, she found carefully neutral expressions and averted eyes. Dr. Theiss cleared her throat, the sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. There is another matter. The consortium has reviewed human psychological profiles and determined that your species' tendency toward emotional attachment to research subjects makes you unsuitable for this type of high-risk wildlife study. Elena's mouth fell open. Emotional attachment? I'm a scientist. My observations are objective and— Your daily logs show increasing fascination with the predator pack, the Valen communications officer interjected, his form shimmering as he spoke. You have named individual specimens and expressed concern for their welfare beyond scientific parameters. Heat rose in Elena's cheeks. It was true that she had begun referring to the alpha female as Luna, and had noticed when one of the younger pack members had been injured. But that was normal for any researcher developing familiarity with their subjects. The decision has been made, Commander Zexai stated with finality. The human will be transferred to the planetary surface for continued observation, while the ship proceeds with new directives. A rescue vessel will retrieve her once the mineral surveys are complete. Elena's blood turned to ice. You're leaving me here? Alone with those predators? You express such confidence in your ability to communicate with them, Dr. Theiss said, her crystalline features impossible to read. This will provide an excellent opportunity to test your theories. The room erupted in what Elena now realized was planned chaos. Crew members moved with practiced efficiency, clearly having discussed this beforehand. Her personal effects were already packed, her research equipment prepared for surface deployment. This is insane, Elena protested, but her voice was lost in the activity around her. I'm a xenobiologist, not a survival expert. Those creatures are predators. Commander Zexai loomed over her, his multiple arms gesturing dismissively. Human emotional responses were anticipated. You will be provided with standard survival equipment and emergency rations. Your knowledge of the species should be sufficient for basic coexistence. As the crew prepared for her forced departure, Elena realized the horrible truth. This wasn't about scientific protocols or safety concerns. This was about fear and prejudice. Her human ability to form emotional connections, to see beyond mere data, had marked her as a liability in their sterile approach to research. The transport pod was small and cramped, filled with basic supplies that seemed pitifully inadequate for survival on an alien world. As the bay doors opened and the pod descended toward the forest canopy, Elena caught a final glimpse of the Nexus dawn through the small porthole. The ship was already turning away, its sleek form disappearing into the star-filled void. She was truly alone, falling toward a world where massive predators ruled the forests, and her only hope of survival lay in proving that human emotional attachment might be exactly what was needed to bridge the gap between species. The pod's landing thrusters fired, and Elena braced herself for impact, both literal and metaphorical. Her old life was ending, but perhaps something new was about to begin. 2 weeks had passed since Elena's abandonment, and her relationship with the luminous ones had evolved beyond her wildest scientific dreams. What had begun as cautious observation had transformed into genuine communication, with Elena learning to interpret the complex patterns of light and sound that constituted their language. The young one she had first made contact with, whom she had privately named Spark, for its particularly bright markings, had become her primary communication partner. Spark displayed a patience and intelligence that reminded Elena of the most gifted graduate students she had worked with, carefully repeating patterns and introducing new concepts at a pace Elena could follow. Through their exchanges, Elena had learned that the luminous ones called themselves something that roughly translated to children of the singing light. Their society was far more complex than she had initially imagined, with distinct roles based not on physical dominance but on intellectual specialization. Spark, despite being young, was apparently what Elena could only describe as a linguist, an individual specially gifted in communication with other species. The breakthrough came when Elena managed to convey her own name through a combination of light, patterns, and vocalizations. The concept of individual identity seemed to resonate with the pack, and within days, Elena found herself accepted as a strange but legitimate member of their social structure. This acceptance brought unexpected benefits. The luminous ones began sharing their knowledge of the planet's resources, guiding Elena to fresh water sources and edible plants. They demonstrated which areas to avoid, regions where other, more dangerous predators hunted, and showed her how to read the subtle environmental signs that indicated weather changes. Elena's scientific training allowed her to recognize that she was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. No other species in the consortium had managed to establish meaningful communication with a non-spacefaring civilization. The closest attempts had resulted in basic trade relationships or territorial agreements, nothing approaching the cultural exchange she was experiencing. The luminous one's technology was biological rather than mechanical, based on manipulation of their own bioluminescent capabilities and deep understanding of their ecosystem. They had developed techniques for encouraging certain plants to grow in specific patterns, creating living architecture that blended seamlessly with the forest. Their tools were cultivated rather than manufactured, specialized organisms that served functions similar to human technology, but through biological processes. Elena documented everything meticulously, though she wondered if anyone would ever read her reports. The communication equipment in her shelter had limited range, and the Nexus Dawn had long since departed the system. Still, the scientist in her demanded thorough documentation of these remarkable discoveries. Her relationship with the pack deepened when Elena proved herself during a crisis. A juvenile member of the group had become trapped in a collapsed burrow during a hunting expedition. The pack's attempts to free the youngster had only made the situation worse, with loose soil threatening to completely bury the trapped individual. Elena's smaller size and human dexterity allowed her to carefully excavate a path to the trapped juvenile. Working alongside Spark and several adults, she spent hours carefully removing debris and stabilizing the makeshift tunnel. When they finally freed the injured youngster, the relief and gratitude expressed by the pack through their light displays was unmistakable. The rescue earned Elena a new status within the group. She was no longer just a tolerated outsider, but a valued pack member with unique capabilities. The adult she had helped save, a female with distinctive silver markings whom Elena called Silver, became particularly protective of her human rescuer. It was Silver who taught Elena about the pack's complex spiritual beliefs. The luminous ones viewed their bioluminescence as a connection to what they called the Great Pattern, a cosmic network of light and energy that connected all living things. According to their mythology, different species contributed different aspects to this universal pattern, and Elena's presence represented a new thread being woven into their local section of the cosmic tapestry. Elena found herself deeply moved by this philosophy. After experiencing abandonment and rejection by her own crew, the acceptance and integration offered by the luminous ones filled an emotional void she hadn't realized existed. These beings, whom the Galactic Consortium had dismissed as mere predators, possessed a spiritual and intellectual sophistication that rivaled any spacefaring civilization. The turning point came during Elena's third week planetside. She had been working with Spark to develop a more sophisticated communication system when the pack's behavior suddenly changed. Their light patterns shifted to urgent warning configurations, and the adults began moving the juveniles toward the deeper forest. Through frantic exchanges with Spark, Elena learned that another pack was approaching, one with a reputation for territorial aggression. The children of the Singing Light were generally peaceful, but this incoming group, known as the Storm Runners, had been expanding their territory and forcing other packs to relocate. Elena suggested that she could help mediate, using her unique position as a neutral party to facilitate communication between the groups. The pack's alpha, a massive individual with golden markings whom Elena called Goldheart, was initially skeptical. Humans, after all, had no experience with inter-pack negotiations among the luminous ones. But Spark advocated for Elena's involvement, explaining through rapid light patterns that the human had demonstrated wisdom in solving problems that the pack couldn't address alone. After considerable discussion among the adults, Goldheart agreed to let Elena attempt mediation. The meeting took place in a neutral clearing where the territories bordered. Elena found herself standing between two groups of massive predators, serving as an interpreter and diplomatic bridge. The Storm Runners were indeed more aggressive, their light patterns harsh and demanding, but Elena gradually recognized that their expansion was driven by necessity rather than simple conquest. Through careful questioning and translation, Elena learned that the Storm Runners' traditional territory had been devastated by seismic activity. They weren't seeking to dominate but to survive, though their desperate situation had made them confrontational in their approach to negotiations. Elena proposed a solution that combined human diplomatic concepts with Luminous One social structures. Rather than territorial displacement, she suggested a temporary merger of the packs with specific roles and responsibilities that would benefit both groups. The Storm Runners' knowledge of geological instability could help predict and avoid future disasters, while the children of the Singing Light's expertise in biological cultivation could help restore damaged ecosystems. The negotiations lasted for hours, with Elena facilitating complex discussions about resource sharing, territorial boundaries, and cultural integration. By the end, both packs had agreed to a trial cooperation that would address the Storm Runners' immediate needs while preserving the children of the Singing Light's established territory. And as the two groups began the process of careful integration, Elena realized she had accomplished something no consortium diplomat had ever achieved. She had successfully mediated a complex interspecies conflict using nothing but empathy, patience, and genuine respect for both cultures. Watching the two packs begin to merge their light patterns in ceremonial displays of unity, Elena felt a profound sense of purpose. The crew of the Nexus Dawn had abandoned her because they viewed her human emotional responses as weaknesses. But those same qualities, her ability to empathize, to see beyond surface differences, to form genuine connections, had proven to be exactly the tools needed for true interspecies cooperation. She was no longer the abandoned human struggling to survive. She had become something new, a bridge between worlds, a translator of cultures, and perhaps most importantly, living proof that emotional intelligence was not a human weakness but a galactic strength. A month into her unexpected new life, Elena had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a human fully integrated into an alien society. The merged pack, now calling themselves the Bridge Builders in honor of Elena's diplomatic success, had grown to nearly 40 individuals spanning 3 generations. Elena found herself holding a unique position as both cultural advisor and interspecies translator. Her days were filled with activities she could never have imagined during her sterile shipboard existence. Mornings were spent with the juveniles, teaching them basic human concepts while learning their traditional hunting techniques. The young luminous ones were fascinated by Elena's bipedal locomotion and opposable thumbs, while Elena marveled at their ability to communicate across vast distances using coordinated light displays. Spark had become her closest companion and primary collaborator in developing a comprehensive translation system. Together, they had created a hybrid communication method that combined human linguistic concepts with luminous one-light patterns. This breakthrough allowed for increasingly sophisticated exchanges of information about everything from astronomical observations to philosophical concepts. Elena's integration into pack life had revealed aspects of Luminous One civilization that completely contradicted the consortium's assumptions about pre-spaceflight species. The bridge builders possessed advanced mathematical concepts, expressed through geometric light patterns that could represent complex calculations and abstract relationships. Their understanding of astronomy, developed through centuries of studying the night sky, rivaled that of many spacefaring civilizations. Most remarkably, Elena discovered that the Luminous Ones had been aware of galactic civilization for generations. They had observed ships passing through their system, and had even developed theories about the various species that occasionally visited their world. However, they had deliberately avoided contact, believing that their peaceful society might be threatened by what they perceived as aggressive, technology-dependent civilizations. This revelation forced Elena to confront uncomfortable truths about the Galactic Research Consortium. The Luminous Ones. Concerns about spacefaring species were not unfounded. Elena herself had witnessed the casual dismissal of primitive civilizations and the exploitation of resources on inhabited worlds. The consortium's approach to research was often extractive rather than collaborative, taking what they needed without consideration for local populations. Elena's growing understanding of these dynamics was interrupted by an event that would test everything she had learned. Spark burst into her shelter one evening, light patterns flashing in urgent alarm configurations. Through rapid exchanges, Elena learned that the Pack's long-range scouts had detected something troubling. Ships approaching the planet. Elena's heart sank as she recognized the energy signatures displayed in Spark's light patterns. The vessels bore the characteristic configuration of consortium science ships, but these weren't research vessels. The signatures matched those of resource extraction fleets, industrial operations designed to strip valuable materials from planetary surfaces with minimal regard for environmental impact. The approaching fleet posed a direct threat to everything Elena had come to value. The Luminous Ones' carefully maintained ecosystem, their living architecture, their entire civilization could be destroyed within days if the extraction operations proceeded as planned. Elena realized she was facing a choice that would define not only her own future, but potentially the fate of an entire species. Working frantically with Spark and the Pack's other communication specialists, Elena began developing a desperate plan. The consortium would expect to find an empty world with easily cataloged wildlife. They wouldn't be prepared for organized resistance or evidence of genuine intelligence. Elena's unique position as both human and Pack member gave her the ability to coordinate a response that could surprise the approaching fleet. The first phase involved demonstrating the Luminous One's intelligence in ways the consortium couldn't dismiss. Elena helped organize massive coordinated light displays visible from orbit, geometric patterns and mathematical sequences that would be impossible to explain as natural phenomena. These displays were timed to coincide with the fleet's initial surveys, ensuring that the evidence of intelligence would be recorded in their first reports. Simultaneously, Elena worked with the Pack's biological specialists to accelerate certain natural processes. The Luminous One's ability to encourage plant growth was redirected toward creating visible messages on the planet's surface, living text that spelled out warnings and mathematical proofs in multiple consortium languages. These biosignatures would be impossible to overlook during standard orbital surveys. The most dangerous aspect of Elena's plan involved direct communication attempts. Using her shelter's limited transmission equipment, enhanced with biological amplifiers developed by the Pack, Elena began broadcasting messages toward the approaching fleet. Her transmissions combined standard consortium protocols with evidence of the sophisticated civilization she had discovered. Elena knew that revealing her presence was risky. The crew of the Nexus Dawn had abandoned her here expecting her to die, and they certainly hadn't reported her survival to higher authorities. Her unexpected messages from a planet, supposedly inhabited only by animals, would raise questions that could expose the prejudice and callousness that had led to her abandonment. But Elena had moved beyond caring about her own career or reputation. She had found something more valuable than professional advancement, a place where her human capacity for empathy and connection was not only valued but essential. The Luminous Ones had shown her a way of existing that balanced intellectual achievement with emotional wisdom, individual growth with community responsibility. As the fleet drew closer, Elena prepared for what might be her final scientific report. Working with Spark and other Pack members, she compiled comprehensive documentation of Luminous One civilization, their language, technology, social structures, spiritual beliefs, and sophisticated understanding of their place in the cosmos. This documentation would serve multiple purposes: evidence of the species' intelligence for the consortium, a historical record for the luminous ones themselves, and proof of what could be achieved through genuine interspecies cooperation. The report also included Elena's personal testimony about her experiences. She detailed the prejudice she had faced aboard the Nexus Dawn, the cruel abandonment that had been disguised as scientific necessity, and the remarkable civilization she had discovered through approaches the consortium had dismissed as weakness. Elena's documentation revealed that human emotional intelligence, far from being a liability in interspecies relations, was actually a crucial tool for genuine communication and cooperation. Her ability to form emotional connections had allowed her to achieve breakthroughs that the consortium's sterile, purely analytical approaches had never accomplished. As the first consortium ships entered the planet's atmosphere, Elena stood surrounded by her chosen family of luminous ones, their bioluminescent patterns creating a galaxy of supportive light around her. She activated her enhanced communication array and began broadcasting her message to the galaxy. Her transmission would change everything, exposing the truth about the consortium's prejudices, revealing the existence of a sophisticated non-spacefaring civilization, and demonstrating that the human traits deemed weaknesses by other species were actually humanity's greatest contribution to galactic society. Elena smiled as she watched the approaching ships, knowing that the sterile corridors and dismissive colleagues of her past were about to encounter something that would challenge every assumption they held about intelligence, civilization, and the value of emotional connection in the vast cosmos. The abandoned human was about to rescue not only herself and her adopted family, but potentially transform the entire galaxy's approach to interspecies relations. Her greatest discovery wasn't the luminous one's civilization. It was proof that humanity's capacity for empathy and emotional wisdom represented an evolutionary advantage that the galaxy desperately needed. The lead consortium vessel Prosperity's Edge descended through the atmosphere with the confident efficiency of a fleet that expected no complications. Admiral Corvin Thex, a veteran Karathi military commander, reviewed the mission parameters with satisfaction. The planet showed rich mineral deposits, abundant biomass for processing, and according to the Nexus Dawn's initial reports, nothing more intelligent than pack predators that could be easily contained or relocated. The first sign that something was wrong came from the sensor operator, a nervous Zephyrian technician whose crystalline form flickered with agitation. "Admiral, I'm detecting coordinated light patterns across multiple continental surfaces. The formations are geometric, mathematical." Admiral Thex's mandibles clicked in annoyance. "Clarify your readings, Technician Vexilin. Are you suggesting natural phenomena are displaying mathematical properties?" "Sir. The patterns include prime number sequences, geometric progressions, and what appears to be graphical representations of physical constants. The probability of natural occurrence is essentially zero." Before Admiral Thex could respond, the communications array erupted with incoming transmissions. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unmistakably human, but it spoke with an authority and knowledge that made the Admiral's carapace shiver. "Consortium Fleet Prosperity's Edge, this is Dr. Elena Vasquez, representing the sovereign civilization of Kepler 442c. You are approaching a planet inhabited by a sophisticated, non-spacefaring species with full territorial rights under Galactic Accord Section 7.3. I am transmitting comprehensive documentation of their civilization, status, and a formal request for diplomatic recognition." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of ship systems. Admiral Thex felt his confidence evaporating as the implications hit him. A human on a supposedly uninhabited world, claiming to represent an indigenous civilization, citing specific galactic law. This was rapidly becoming the kind of situation that ended military careers. "Technician Vexilin, verify the origin of that transmission."
"How is there a human on this planet?"
The Zephyrian's form flickered more rapidly as he worked. "The transmission originates from the surface, sir. Bioscan confirms a single human life sign. But the technology appears to be a hybrid of consortium standard equipment and something else. Something biological." Elena's voice continued with calm professionalism that contrasted sharply with the chaos on the consortium bridge. "Admiral Thex, I have detailed records of this species' language, technology, social structures, and spiritual beliefs. They possess mathematical knowledge equivalent to early spacefaring civilizations, sophisticated astronomical observations, and a form of biotechnology that surpasses many consortium member species in specific applications. "This is impossible," Admiral Thex muttered, but even as he spoke, his tactical displays were updating with new information. The planet's surface showed massive coordinated activity, not the random movements of animals, but organized patterns that suggested complex communication and planning. Elena's next transmission struck like a plasma bolt to the Admiral's confidence. "I should mention that my presence here results from abandonment by the research vessel Nexus Dawn, under circumstances that violated multiple consortium protocols regarding crew safety and species discrimination. I have comprehensive documentation of these violations, including recorded evidence of prejudicial statements and deliberate endangerment." Admiral Thex realized he was facing a potential diplomatic and legal catastrophe. The Nexus Dawn's mission logs had reported this planet as suitable for resource extraction with no complications. There had been no mention of stranded personnel or evidence of indigenous intelligence. "Dr. Vasquez," Admiral Thex managed, struggling to maintain official composure, "please transmit your documentation for review. We will suspend extraction operations pending verification of your claims. Transmission incoming now, Admiral. I should warn you that the indigenous species, the children of the singing light, are monitoring this conversation through methods you might not expect. They are remarkably intelligent and have been observing galactic civilization for centuries. Your response to this situation will determine not only their future, but potentially the consortium's reputation throughout this entire sector." As Elena's documentation flooded the ship's computers, Admiral Thex watched his simple extraction mission transform into something that would require the attention of the highest levels of consortium government. The files contained linguistic analyses, cultural studies, technological assessments, and detailed observations of a civilization that clearly met every criterion for sovereignty, recognition, but perhaps most damaging were Elena's personal logs documenting her treatment aboard the Nexus. The recordings revealed casual bigotry, deliberate sabotage of research efforts, and finally outright abandonment, all based on prejudice against human emotional responses and their approach to interspecies relations. Elena's voice returned, now carrying an edge of steel beneath its professional tone. "Admiral, I'm also transmitting real-time translations of the indigenous population's current communications. They are aware of your presence and are prepared to demonstrate their defensive capabilities if necessary. I strongly recommend against any actions that could be interpreted as hostile." As if summoned by her words, the planet's surface erupted in coordinated light displays. Millions of bioluminescent patterns flashed in perfect synchronization across multiple continents, creating geometric forms visible from orbit. The display was clearly artificial, clearly intelligent, and absolutely impossible to dismiss as natural phenomena. Admiral Thex found himself in the position no military commander wanted to face, completely outmaneuvered by circumstances he hadn't anticipated. His fleet was designed for resource extraction from uninhabited worlds, not diplomatic first contact with sophisticated civilizations. Every protocol he knew was useless in this situation. "Dr. Vasquez, what are your recommendations for proceeding?" Elena's response came with the confidence of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. "I propose immediate diplomatic recognition of the children of the singing light as a sovereign species, formal acknowledgement of their territorial rights, and establishment of appropriate first contact protocols. I am willing to serve as initial liaison, given my established relationship with the indigenous leadership. And regarding the circumstances of your presence on this planet, that will require a full investigation by consortium internal affairs, including review of the Nexus Dawn's mission logs and interviews with all crew members involved in the decision to abandon me here. The children of the singing light have expressed interest in formal complaints against consortium practices, but they are willing to work through diplomatic channels if appropriate reforms are implemented." Admiral Thex realized that Elena held all the strategic advantages. She had irrefutable evidence of consortium violations, documentation of an undiscovered civilization, and the support of what appeared to be a remarkably sophisticated indigenous species. His extraction fleet had suddenly become unwitting participants in the most significant first contact event in recent galactic history. "Dr. Vasquez," I am officially recognizing your authority as liaison for this first contact situation. Please transmit formal protocols for communication with the indigenous leadership. The consortium fleet will maintain orbital position pending arrival of appropriate diplomatic personnel. As Elena's next transmission provided detailed instructions for respectful interaction with the luminous ones, Admiral Thex began composing what he knew would be the most difficult report of his career. He would have to explain how a routine extraction mission had uncovered evidence of systematic prejudice within the consortium's research divisions and accidentally initiated diplomatic relations with a previously unknown civilization. But perhaps most significantly, he would have to acknowledge that a human, a member of the species many consortium members dismissed as emotionally unstable, had accomplished something no other galactic diplomat had achieved: genuine integration with a non-spacefaring civilization and successful mediation of first contact protocols. Elena's final transmission of the day carried a note of quiet satisfaction. Admiral, the children of the Singing Light have asked me to convey their cautious optimism about formal relations with galactic civilization. They believe that species capable of learning from their mistakes and correcting injustices might be worthy partners in the greater cosmic community. They look forward to proving that emotional wisdom and analytical intelligence are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true civilization. Admiral Thex stared at the light displays flickering across the planet's surface and realized that everything the consortium thought it knew about intelligence, civilization, and the value of different species' contributions was about to be fundamentally challenged by the abandoned human who had become the galaxy's most unlikely ambassador. 3 days after the fleet's arrival, the planet had become the center of unprecedented galactic attention. Ships from a dozen different consortium species had arrived to witness what was being called the Vasquez Protocol, the first successful integration of a galactic citizen with a pre-spaceflight civilization. Elena found herself at the center of a diplomatic revolution that was reshaping interspecies relations across known space. The formal negotiations took place in a specially constructed pavilion that exemplified the new, cooperative approach Elena had pioneered. Human engineering provided the structural framework, consortium technology supplied communications equipment, and Luminous One biotechnology created living walls that pulsed with translated conversations, allowing all participants to follow discussions regardless of their native communication methods. Elena sat between Goldheart, the Pack Alpha whose golden markings had grown even more brilliant with age and authority, and Spark, whose role had evolved from translator to full diplomatic representative. Across from them sat a collection of the galaxy's most senior diplomats, species representatives who had come to witness what many considered impossible: a human serving as successful intermediary between galactic civilization and an indigenous culture. The head of the consortium delegation was Ambassador Errol Nethys, a Veilon whose ethereal form shimmered with what Elena had learned to recognize as barely controlled amazement. The ambassador had arrived expecting to manage a minor diplomatic incident, and instead found herself confronting evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, communication, and the nature of civilization itself. Dr. Vasquez, Ambassador Nethys began, her voice carrying the harmonic qualities typical of her species. Your documentation suggests that the children of the Singing Light have been aware of galactic civilization for multiple generations. Why did they never attempt contact? Elena exchanged light patterns with Spark before responding. They observed our interactions with other species and concluded that galactic civilization tends to either exploit or dismiss cultures that don't match established technological criteria. The children of the Singing Light developed sophisticated screening methods to avoid contact until they could be certain of receiving respectful treatment. This revelation sent ripples of uncomfortable recognition through the assembled diplomats. Elena's words contained an implicit criticism of consortium practices that none of them could easily refute. The galaxy was filled with worlds that had been surveyed without consideration for indigenous populations, resources extracted without permission from local inhabitants, and civilizations dismissed as primitive simply because they hadn't developed spaceflight. Goldheart's light patterns pulsed in what Elena had learned was formal address mode. Elena translated, The Great Alpha acknowledges that some galactic species show wisdom and growth potential. The children of the Singing Light are willing to share knowledge and establish cooperation with those who demonstrate genuine respect for different paths to understanding. Ambassador Nethys leaned forward, her form brightening with interest. What kind of knowledge sharing are they prepared to consider? Elena smiled as Spark launched into an enthusiastic display that would have been impossible to follow without months of immersion in Luminous One culture. The children of the Singing Light have developed biotechnology applications that could revolutionize several galactic industries. Their ability to encourage specific plant growth patterns could solve food shortage problems on multiple worlds. Their understanding of biological light generation could provide sustainable energy solutions for dozens of species. And they're willing to share this knowledge? This came from a Karathi trade representative whose 6 arms gestured with barely contained excitement. They're willing to share knowledge with species that demonstrate genuine partnership rather than exploitation. The children of the Singing Light propose what they call symbiotic exchange, long-term cooperative relationships, where each species contributes their unique strengths rather than simply trading resources. Elena paused to let this concept sink in before continuing. But they have specific requirements for any formal alliance. First, full recognition of their sovereignty and territorial rights. Second, guarantees that any knowledge sharing will benefit both civilizations rather than creating dependency. And third, establishment of protocols that prevent the kind of cultural contamination that has destroyed indigenous populations on other worlds. The negotiations continued for hours, with Elena serving as more than just a translator. Her months of integration with the Luminous Ones had given her insights into their thought processes, values, and concerns that allowed her to bridge conceptual gaps that would have stymied traditional diplomatic approaches. During breaks in formal sessions, Elena found herself fielding questions from individual delegates about her own transformation. The story of the abandoned human who had not only survived but thrived among alien predators had become legendary throughout the consortium. But many species representatives struggled to understand how it had been possible. Dr. Theiss, the Zephyrian scientist who had participated in Elena's original abandonment, had arrived with the diplomatic mission looking profoundly uncomfortable. During one break, she approached Elena with what her crystalline features suggested was considerable embarrassment. Dr. Vasquez, I must acknowledge that our assessment of your capabilities was inadequate. The Consortium's evaluation protocols failed to recognize the value of human emotional intelligence in interspecies relations. Elena studied the alien scientist who had once dismissed her as emotionally compromised. Dr. Theiss, what you and the others saw as weakness, my tendency to form emotional connections with research subjects, turned out to be exactly what was needed for genuine communication. The children of the Singing Light don't separate intellectual understanding from emotional connection the way galactic civilization does. How did you manage the transition? The psychological adjustment from galactic citizen to this? Dr. Theiss gestured toward Elena's modified clothing and the bioluminescent translation device that Spark had bioengineered to grow from her shoulder. Elena considered the question carefully. I didn't abandon my human identity, Dr. Theiss, I expanded it. The children of the Singing Light taught me that intelligence and emotion aren't opposing forces. They're complementary aspects of understanding. My human capacity for empathy allowed me to recognize their intelligence, while their wisdom helped me see the limitations in purely analytical approaches to interspecies relations. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the main negotiating area. Spark's light patterns were flashing in urgent configurations while several consortium delegates looked confused and concerned. Elena hurried over to find Ambassador Nethys trying to understand a complex proposal that the translation systems were struggling to convey. Elena quickly interfaced with Spark's communication patterns and began translating. The children of the Singing Light are proposing something unprecedented, a joint research station that would serve as a permanent liaison facility between galactic civilization and their culture. But they want it designed using cooperative principles that challenge traditional consortium approaches. What kind of principles? Ambassador Nethys asked. Elena's translation of Spark's rapid light displays took several minutes to convey properly. They propose a research facility where both cultures contribute equally to design and operation. Galactic technology would provide space-capable facilities, while Luminous One biotechnology would create sustainable life support and environmental systems. Research would focus on developing technologies that benefit both civilizations rather than extracting knowledge for galactic use. The proposal sparked intense discussion among the consortium delegates. Traditional research stations were designed to study indigenous populations, not to collaborate with them as equals. The Children of the Singing Light were essentially proposing the first truly cooperative interspecies research facility in galactic history. Elena watched the debates with growing excitement. The concepts being discussed would fundamentally change how galactic civilization approached relationships with non-spacefaring species. Instead of the traditional model of study, exploitation, or benevolent guidance, the Luminous Ones were proposing genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared benefit. As the day's sessions concluded, Elena found herself standing on the pavilion's observation deck with Spark and several other pack members. Watching the constellation of ships in orbit around their world, the sight that would once have filled her with homesickness now represented something far more complex, proof that galactic civilization was capable of growth and change. Spark's light patterns conveyed something like contentment mixed with anticipation. Elena translated the concept for her own understanding. The Children of the Singing Light were cautiously optimistic that they had found partners worthy of their wisdom, while remaining prepared to defend their culture if necessary. Elena smiled as she watched the alien ships above and felt the familiar warmth of bioluminescent patterns around her. She was no longer the abandoned human struggling for survival, or the rescued castaway. 6 months after first contact, the planet Kepler 442c had become the most significant diplomatic and scientific center in the known galaxy. The joint research station hung in stable orbit like a living jewel, its hybrid design representing everything Elena had fought to achieve. Consortium engineering provided the skeletal framework and life support systems, while Luminous One biotechnology created gardens that served as both air recyclers and cultural spaces where representatives from dozens of species could meet and learn. Elena stood in the station's central observation deck, watching as the latest group of diplomatic cadets practiced the communication protocols she had developed. Young representatives from 12 different species worked alongside juvenile Luminous Ones, learning the complex interplay of analytical thinking and emotional intelligence that had become known throughout the galaxy as the Vasquez method. The transformation had been more complete than anyone had anticipated. Elena's approach to interspecies relations had triggered a fundamental shift in galactic civilization's understanding of intelligence and communication. Universities across consortium space now taught courses in emotional linguistics. Diplomatic Corps training included mandatory sessions on empathetic connection. Research protocols had been completely rewritten to emphasize cooperation over extraction. But perhaps the most significant change was occurring on a personal level throughout the galaxy. Species that had coexisted for centuries without truly understanding each other were discovering new depths of communication and cooperation. The rigid hierarchies and cultural barriers that had defined interspecies relations were giving way to more fluid, collaborative approaches. Spark approached with the graceful confidence that had developed during their months as Elena's primary collaborator. The young Luminous One had become something unprecedented, a non-spacefaring species serving as a full diplomatic representative in galactic affairs. Through their partnership, Elena had helped establish the principle that intelligence and wisdom could take forms that spacefaring civilizations had never imagined. The evening council session is prepared, Spark communicated through the hybrid light and sound system they had perfected. The Andromedan representatives have arrived with interesting proposals for cultural exchange. Elena smiled as she prepared to join, another session that would have been impossible under the old diplomatic protocols. The Andromedans were among the most rigid and hierarchy-focused species in the galaxy. Yet even they had been transformed by exposure to the cooperative approaches pioneered on Kepler 442c. As they walked through corridors that pulsed with living light, Elena reflected on the personal journey that had brought her to this point. The scared, abandoned researcher who had crashed on this planet no longer existed. In her place was something new, a human who had learned to balance analytical thinking with emotional wisdom, individual achievement with community responsibility. and galactic citizenship with deep connection to a specific world and culture. The council chamber was a masterpiece of hybrid design, with traditional consortium seating arrangements integrated into a living amphitheater created by Luminous One biotechnology. The walls themselves served as translation surfaces, displaying conversations in the light patterns, harmonic frequencies, and symbolic representations needed for each participant to follow discussions in their native communication mode. Ambassador Nethys had become one of Elena's strongest supporters. Her initial skepticism transformed into genuine advocacy for the new approaches. She opened the session with formal recognition of the achievements that had emerged from what everyone now called the Kepler experiment. 6 months ago, we faced what appeared to be a diplomatic crisis, Ambassador Nethys began. Instead, we discovered that our fundamental assumptions about intelligence, communication, and cooperation were limiting our potential as a galactic community. The protocols developed here have already prevented 3 potential conflicts and established successful cooperation agreements with previously isolated species. Elena felt a warm pulse from Spark's bioluminescent patterns, the Luminous One equivalent of pride and satisfaction. Around the chamber, representatives from dozens of species displayed their own versions of approval and agreement through gesture, sound, and biodisplay. The Andromedan delegation leader, a crystalline being whose name translated roughly to harmonious precision, stood to address the assembly. The Andromedan Collective acknowledges the effectiveness of empathetic communication protocols. Our recent negotiations with the Spiral Arm Confederacy achieved unprecedented cooperation levels using methods adapted from the Vasquez protocols. Elena had to suppress a smile at the formal language that couldn't quite disguise the revolutionary implications. The Andromedans admitting that emotional approaches had improved their diplomatic effectiveness represented a complete reversal of their traditional position, but the most significant moment came when a new representative entered the chamber, Commander Zexhai from the Nexus Dawn, the very Karathi who had orchestrated Elena's abandonment. He approached Elena's position with obvious discomfort, his multiple arms betraying nervous tension despite his attempt at formal bearing. Dr. Vasquez, he began, his translator struggling with concepts that Karathi language didn't naturally accommodate. I must formally acknowledge the errors in judgment that led to your abandonment on this world. The Consortium Internal Affairs. Investigation has concluded that species prejudice clouded our evaluation of your capabilities and contributions. Elena studied the being who had once dismissed her as emotionally compromised and therefore useless for serious research. She felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just personal vindication, but a symbol of the broader transformation occurring throughout galactic civilization. Commander Zexhai, Elena replied, choosing her words carefully. The investigation's findings are important for preventing future incidents, but what matters more is what we've learned about the value of different approaches to intelligence and problem-solving. Your actions inadvertently led to discoveries that have benefited the entire galaxy. The commander's mandibles clicked, and what Elena had learned was Karathi embarrassment. Nevertheless, I must request permission to undergo empathetic communication training. The Karathi military has decided to implement new protocols based on your methods, and I have been selected to lead the transition. Elena exchanged rapid light patterns with Spark, whose response carried overtones of amusement and approval. The children of the Singing Light would be honored to participate in Karathi military training. They believe that true strength comes from understanding, not dominance. As the formal sessions concluded and delegates began the complex social interactions that had become central to the new diplomatic approaches, Elena found herself on the observation deck with Goldheart and several other senior pack members. The Great Alpha's golden markings had evolved new patterns that Elena had learned represented deep satisfaction and hope for the future. Through Spark's translation, Goldheart conveyed the pack's assessment of the changes they had witnessed. The galactic species show capacity for wisdom beyond their original limitations. The human Elena has proven that growth and connection are possible even for civilizations that began with separation and analysis. The great pattern grows stronger through this cooperation. Elena looked out at the planet below, where new settlements were being established using hybrid technologies that combined the best of galactic engineering with Luminous One biotechnology. The world that had once been targeted for resource extraction had become a center of innovation and cooperation. Ships from across the galaxy regularly arrived, bringing delegations eager to learn the communication and cooperation methods that had emerged from Elena's integration with the luminous ones. What had begun as one human struggle for survival had evolved into a transformation of galactic civilization itself. But perhaps the most significant change was in Elena herself. She had learned to see her human traits, empathy, emotional connection, the ability to form bonds across species barriers, not as weaknesses to be overcome, but as humanity's unique contribution to galactic civilization. Humans, she had discovered, possessed an almost unmatched capacity for adaptation and connection that could serve as bridges between species that might otherwise remain isolated. As Elena prepared for sleep in her quarters that seamlessly blended human comfort with luminous one living architecture, she reflected on the message she would record for the historical archives. Future generations would need to understand not just what had happened here, but why it mattered for the ongoing evolution of galactic civilization. Personal log. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief Liaison for Interspecies Cooperation. Kepler Station, she began. 6 months ago, I was abandoned on this world by colleagues who saw my human emotional responses as weaknesses unsuitable for serious scientific work. Today I serve as living proof that those same traits represent humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. Elena paused, watching bioluminescent patterns flow through the living walls of her quarters as luminous one-night shift workers maintained the station's biological systems.